lot of the plants people grow in their gardens as ornamentals are also edible. This is, a lot of people call this sedum, although it's now placed in the genus Hylotelephium. But these tall stone crops are a beautiful ornamental. They do really well in full sun, even in droughts, so they're often planted as xeriscaping plants. But the leaves make a really nice salad green. They're thick and succulent, and they add a really nice crunch and juiciness to salads. This is a cardoon that has survived the winter for us. And so we're letting it flower instead of, you can eat these just as you can globe artichokes, but we're letting it go to seed to save seed from this one, because obviously this one survived and others didn't, so this is a slightly hardier cardoon plant. They're listed as zone 6 and I'm in what's comparable to zone 5, and so it should be fairly easy to come up with a hardier cardoon. There's some haskap bushes. Haskaps are a fairly new introduction from the University of Saskatchewan. They're one of the earliest berries to mature. They're little blue oblong berries. They're delicious. They taste a lot like blueberries. And haskaps will grow very well in alkaline soils, whereas blueberries require acidity, which we don't have here. So these grow much more easily than blueberries do. We have to net these against the birds, which is why we have little tripods set up to suspend the nets above the shrubs so that the birds can't get to them. Otherwise, they will denude the entire crop before we can get to it. And these are Stella d'Oro daylilies. Daylilies are a cultivated crop in China. They grow them on a huge scale. In every Chinese grocery store, you'll find golden needles, which are the unopened flower buds of daylilies. So they dry these, they cook them in soups and stews, and you can also eat the flowers. You can eat the tubers of daylilies as well as the shoots in the spring. They're a very useful edible perennial. We always put the flowers in our salads. You can eat the flowers raw. They're quite nice. They're very sweet and crunchy, but you can't eat too many of them or they'll cause diarrhea. But if you cook them, you can eat as many as you like. This is a basswood tree. Basswoods are native to here and they'll get to be 80 feet tall in time if you let them. But this winter I pollarded this, or coppiced it, which is to say that I cut it down to about waist height and then I'm allowing it to re-sprout. So basswood coppices very well. It'll regrow from a stump if you cut it down in the winter. So I did that to keep it small and to keep the leaves within picking height, because the young greens make a very nice salad. This also provides shade to some of the shade-loving crops in the garden, such as sweet cicely. This is sweet cicely. It's often grown as an ornamental. The whole plant is edible and tastes like black licorice. And traditionally, it was used to accompany rhubarb. They would stew it with rhubarb to sweeten the rhubarb because it's quite a sweet flavor. This is in Europe before cane sugar was widely available. And the seeds on this are quite large, and before they ripen, when they're still green, they are like little licorice candies. So now we pluck them off and pickle them quite a bit. They make an excellent pickle, and it's a good way of preserving them for the winter. I also have some Egyptian walking onions in here. These are these little bulbils at the top of the stalk get bigger and bigger until the stalk falls over, and then they grow from there, so they'll walk around your garden. Egyptian walking onions are very hardy. I've never had them die out on me, and they're one of the first greens to come up in the spring. So we use them mainly as green onions, but we've also pickled the top sets, or bulbils, and you can also dig up the underground bulbs and use them just like regular onions. Very easy perennial onion crop. This is a pretty common weed in most gardens. It's called wood sorrel. A lot of people mistake this for clover, but it's not related to clover. It's distantly related to the more cultivated sorrels. But I let this grow because it forms a nice ground cover and it's edible. Every part of the plant is edible. You can eat the leaves, you can eat the young seed pods, you can eat the flowers. It has a really nice sour flavor that goes nicely in salads or soups. You can cook it, you can eat it raw. So a very useful plant. So if you find this in your garden, You can either weed it out and eat it as you weed, or you can let it proliferate. This is another perennial vegetable that was popular in England 200 years ago. This is sea kale, and they used to grow it as a shoot vegetable. They would cover it traditionally with a clay pot in the spring, just as the shoots start emerging from the soil, to force it or blanch it. And then the shoots that grow up inside the pot were white, and they're more tender and mild than the shoots would otherwise be. Then you cut them and steam them or eat them in any way that you would asparagus. And they taste like a mix between asparagus and cabbage. They're very nice. This is a Siberian pea shrub. This is a Siberian plant, and you can eat the young flowers and the young pods. It's a member of the pea family, and it's also a nitrogen fixer, so it'll fertilize the plants around it. We're also using it as a scaffold up which to grow Caucasian spinach. This is a very productive vine. This is a young plant. It's only about 2 years old, but in another 1 or 2 years, this will become a very productive vine, and you can eat the young leaves in salads, and throughout the growing season, it keeps on producing leaves. It's one of my favorite edible perennials. It tastes a lot like spinach, but it's sort of like a mix between spinach and lettuce, so it makes a great salad base. And then down here, there's a ground cover of seedless sorrel. This is another of my favorite perennials. Very, very easy plant to grow. Sorrel gets bitter generally when it produces a seed stalk, but seedless sorrel never gets bitter because it doesn't produce a seed stalk. So it's edible throughout the growing season from spring till fall. They're very sour greens, so if you use them in a salad, you can use less vinaigrette, but we also cook it and use it to make soup. Sorrel soup is a popular soup in Europe, and it's just incredibly productive and forms a really nice ground cover. They get to be about 1 foot wide and 1 foot tall and no bigger, and so they don't spread. So I've planted a bunch of individual plants here about 8 inches apart so that they overlap and form a bomb-proof ground cover that we very rarely have to weed. This is asparagus. This is late summer, so it's all leafed out now, but this gives us a good crop of asparagus shoots in the spring. There's a couple of plants in here. We planted more. We built a woodshed where our big asparagus crop was, so we're planting more now. It does take a while for asparagus to become established, but once it's established, it gives you really nice harvests for many, many years. They live to be at least 30 years old, so everybody should grow asparagus. This is lovage. Lovage is a European perennial. It is a member of the celery family, and it tastes more like celery than celery. It's really quite delicious. The young leaves are a little bit bitter, but in a soup, if you cook it, it's a really nice soup base. We put it sparingly in salads as well. If you take a few leaves and chop them up really finely, it goes really nicely in a salad. And you can also use the leaf stalks, which are hollow. You can use them as straws for Caesars. This is French sorrel. So it's another sorrel. It makes a good ground cover. The leaves are really quite sour, and we put them in salads, and we make soup from it as well. And then over here, these are nodding onions, nodding wild onions, which is a native to Ontario, and the flowers hang, the end of the flower stalk bends over, so the flowers hang beneath the stalk, and it's quite a lovely onion when it's in flower. And we use the greens for green onions, and you can also dig up the bulbs and use them as regular onions. Very easy to plant to grow, and it'll self-seed as well, so really quite a nice one for the ornamental edible garden. There are also some easy to grow perennial culinary herbs. These are chives, this is oregano, this is sage, this is a Turkish rocket. Turkish rocket is foraged in the former USSR. The young greens are picked, they're quite spicy, so they go nicely in a salad sparingly, but the older greens are much too bitter. But when it sends up a flower stalk, the young unopened flower buds are like little broccolis, and they're great. They're spicy, and they can go in stir fries. They can be used just like broccoli. They're an excellent vegetable. This is aronia berry, also known as chokeberry. It's really not a very attractive name, and the berries aren't great raw, but if you cook them just a little bit, it renders them edible. And they're quite nice if you cook them. We cook them in oatmeal. You can make juice from them. We made juice with these and combined it with grapes in a steam juicer, and it's delicious juice. There's a big industry in Europe using these as juice. These are clove currants, which are also native to Ontario, and they are quite delicious. I think they're one of the best tasting currants. This is a cultivated variety, so it's bred for larger berries, but I think it's the nicest of the currants for fresh eating. You can also make preserves from them, but we don't produce quite enough to justify making preserves, so we just eat them raw and throw them in our oatmeal in the morning. These are the seed stalks of patience dock. And the leaves completely disappear when they are flowering, but then they send up a new flush of leaves, and it's the green leaves in the spring and the fall that are edible. And they're cultivated as a vegetable in some parts of Eastern Europe. They use it as a wrap instead of grape leaves to make dolmas and that kind of thing. So we usually just use the leaves, chop it up, and we sometimes eat them raw, but more generally we cook them in soups and stews. It's a very productive vegetable. Over here there's a patch of Good King Henry. This is a plant that the Romans cultivated, and they brought it with them on their escapades throughout Europe. So they introduced it to Western Europe as well as England. It's the young greens in the spring that they would cook and use as a pot herb. So we throw it in soups and stews and stir fries and such. And then you can also use the seed as a grain. I cook it alongside oatmeal. This is a medlar tree. Medlars are an old fruit that was popular in the Middle Ages, and these are the medlars. You can see them quite clearly. It's quite productive, and these are too hard to eat raw before they get a few frosts. So we'll leave them on the tree, and then we'll harvest them in the winter and then process them into a jelly. You can also just pluck them right off the tree in the winter and eat them, and they're quite nice. They taste like a spicy baked apple. And then back here, there's a root vegetable that we grow called skirret. Skirret is related to carrots and parsnips, and it's a very tasty root vegetable. If you dig up a plant, you get a bunch of carrot-like roots. They're about the thickness of your finger and a little longer, and you can divide the plant very easily and replant half of it and then eat the other half to keep it as a perennial. And they're white, and you can roast them. If you roast them, they're delicious. And then we grow groundnut up our skirret. So groundnut is a native perennial tuberous vine. And so in the fall, when we're digging the skirret, we're also digging the groundnut, and it forms little egg-shaped tubers on a string. So you'll get multiple tubers along a string, and we'll cut off the small ones and throw them back and then eat the larger ones. And usually we roast them or we put them in soups. They're a little bit dry to the palate if you roast them, so they need a sauce, or they go very nicely in soups or stews.